now be moving to our scientific part, and I would like to invite Yuval to present the two first presenter. This part will be divided into two. We have two lectures which Yuval will invite, and then we will take a break, have some coffee. יש פה הרבה פנים מוכרים, אני אקח את ה-30 שניות האלו של בוגרים ובוגרות, זה ממש מרגש לראות אתכם פה, אז זה ממש כיף והמון תודה שבאתם. יש פה מרצים די טובים מחוץ לארץ שבאו במיוחד אלינו, וקיצור כיף, אז אני ארצה. בסדר, אני התקלתי את יובל, אז זה בסדר. אוקיי, אז אני אקח את זה, זה בסדר. האורח הראשון, it's an honor for me to present Professor Just Dilip from San Diego. Professor Dilip, please. Professor Dilip is a well-distinguished known psychogeriatrics, a psychiatrist who has been teaching, studying, and researching the field of psychiatry and aging. However, in recent years, he's been moving to quite a fascinating field within aging, which very nicely he was willing to share with us, which is the concept of wisdom and aging. So, Professor, just please, your floor is yours.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to thank Professor Duran for inviting me here and want to congratulate Haifa and Ben Gurion for pioneering work in gerontology over the last 20 years. I have great respect for Israel and its researchers and have collaborated with several of them over the past so many years. You already heard about loneliness from some of the speakers, and I will talk about that along with wisdom. Yeah. So this is my team of colleagues. These include faculty, trainees, as well as staff at the University of California, San Diego, in the Center for Healthy Aging. So I'm going to begin with what is loneliness. Then I will talk about the risk factors as well as health consequences of loneliness. Then going to the opposite side, I will talk about wisdom and possible interventions for reducing loneliness as well as increasing wisdom. One of the miracles of modern medicine has been increase in lifespan. In 1900, the average lifespan in the US and the Western world was about 45 years. Today it is 80 in the US. Israel has even a longer lifespan than US. Why has the lifespan increased? Millions of people died from epidemic of plague, cholera, typhoid, smallpox. The modern medicine developed vaccines and antibiotics to practically eradicate these epidemics. And the lifespan has been increasing. It has been increasing until recently. For the first time since the 1950s, the average lifespan has dropped in the US and for 2 years in a row. Why did it drop? not because of plague, cholera, typhoid. It didn't drop because of cancers, heart disease, or stroke. It is dropping because of behavioral epidemics. What are these behavioral epidemics? Suicides. The rate of suicides in the US have increased by 33% in less than 20 years. And these are suicides occurring in all age groups. Now, starting as young as 10 years of age, and then, of course, going on into older age. So what you see here are the numbers of suicides in men and women. Men have higher risk of suicide than women, and then an average. Even greater has been increase in deaths because of opioids. In 1999, about 8,000 people died per year from opioids. Today, that number is greater than 48,000 per year. Six-fold increase in deaths from opioid abuse in fewer than 20 years. So why is this increase in suicides and opioid? The common factor is probably loneliness. Definitely one of the major factors underlying that. Loneliness and social isolation. I will talk about the exact definitions of these terms in the next slide, but they are closely related. They are called silent killers. It is actually the American Academy of Social Work that declared in 2015 that loneliness was a grand challenge for the society, and they started a campaign to eradicate loneliness. Now, other fields are also realizing the importance of loneliness. Dr. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General of US, said that loneliness is more dangerous to health than several forms of things like smoking and obesity. The US Government Agency on Healthcare Research and Quality reported that 162,000 Americans die every year from social isolation. 162,000. That's greater than the number of people who die from lung cancer or stroke. In the UK, loneliness was a major problem for businesses because they found that the lonely workers were responsible for losses of billions of pounds every year. And so they established a new Ministry of Loneliness. And now several other countries are following suit. So what is loneliness? A British historian named Faye Alberti said that the term loneliness did not exist in English language until 1800. So the word that was used until 1800 was oneliness. So there was no L in that. But it is more than the absence of a letter. Oneliness meant that you can be pretty contented being by yourself. So being alone is not a problem. Something happened around the 1800, and that L got added, and it became loneliness. She thinks, Alberti, that it is because of industrialization. That industrialization that started around in the 1800s changed the societal structure, changed the societal mores, and things became pretty stressful. So what is loneliness? So loneliness is a subjective feeling of distress because of being alone. It is a distress caused by gap between what you want in terms of social relationships and what you have. For example, if I have 5 friends, I can be happy with that because that's all I need. Or I can be unhappy because I want 10 friends, right? So this is a gap between what I want and what I have that causes subjective loneliness. Social isolation, on the other hand, is objective. You can measure it by looking at the number of social relationships somebody has. And yet they are related. If you are socially isolated, you are likely to be lonely, but they are not same. You can be in a crowd and feel lonely, or you can be in a cave by yourself and not feel lonely. So it is a subjective aspect that's really important to consider. So what is it that increases the risk of loneliness, and why should we bother about loneliness? So this is a study we did at San Diego that was published last year, and it got wide publicity. This was a study of 340 adult San Diegans between the ages of 25 and 95. And we used a scale called UCLA-3 loneliness scale. That's the most widely used validated scale for measuring loneliness. We found that loneliness was common across all age groups, but there were 3 periods when it peaked. One period was late 20s, second was mid 50s, and third was late 80s. And I will come back to the 20s in a later slide. But the mid 50s, that's usually thought to be the period of midlife crisis, right? Whereas the late 80s, period when you start losing your spouse, other family members, and start developing more and more physical illnesses. What are the risk factors for loneliness? There was a study done in Chicago, which was a part of health, aging, and retirement study. It was a study of people over the age of 50, about 225 adults. They found that loneliness was more common in racial and ethnic minorities than in Caucasians. However, when they control for education and income, the difference disappeared. In other words, it is not the biology of race or ethnicity that is responsible for loneliness, it is the social factors such as education and income that were responsible for it. Being married and having positive marital relationship, this was among the most protective factor for loneliness, whereas the other risk factors included physical symptoms. People who were physically ill were more likely to be lonely. People who had chronic stress, either stress at work or stress in social relationships, small social network, and type of or quality of social relationship. I mean, you may have 20 friends, but none very close, or you may have 1 or 2 friends who are very close, and that counts. There's also an interesting study of loneliness and student-parent communication. This was a study of 211 college students. Some of the students had good relationship with their parents and others didn't. The study found that the students who usually communicated with their parents through phone calls had a more satisfying, intimate, and supportive parental relationship than the students who communicated with their parents through some social network site. So if you communicate with your parents through Facebook, it is not as good or as useful as communicating by calling on phone or ideally meeting in person. Of course, here, the relationship is probably bidirectional. If you don't have a good relationship, you're less likely to call, and vice versa. But this has something to do with excessive use of social media for communication is not helpful. Loneliness is a biological construct. I mean, it is, of course, affected by psychosocial factors, but it is biologically based. There's a last study of nearly 500,000 people in the UK looking at the genes. And they found that loneliness was about 35 to 55% inherited, which also meant that half of loneliness was not inherited and entirely affected by environment and behavior. The genes associated with loneliness were also associated with increased risk of physical diseases like metabolic diseases, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, for example, as well as depression and dementia. There is also some growing literature on neurobiology of loneliness. Where in the brain is loneliness located? Of course, we don't know yet. The science has not developed to that extent yet. However, there are studies suggesting that specific parts of the brain, like the ventral striatum, are likely to be involved in loneliness. So people who are lonely respond differently to social interactions than people who are not. And you can see those differences on doing things like functional MRI or PET scans. And I will come back to this neurobiology when I talk about wisdom. Why should we bother about loneliness? Because loneliness increases the risk of illnesses. I talked to you earlier about increased mortality. Why is this increased mortality? Because the risk of diseases increases. In one study, for example, of more than 6,000 people in the UK, they followed these people, older people, over a period of 6 years. A proportion of them developed dementia. People who had loneliness at baseline were much more likely to develop dementia than people who did not have loneliness. And this is after controlling for a bunch of factors that you would want to control for, including education, income, and what have you. An Irish study of more than 5,000 people followed people over a period of 4 years, and they found that people who were lonely had a higher risk of developing major depression or generalized anxiety disorder. So loneliness is a risk factor for things like depression, dementia, as well as heart disease, diabetes, and a bunch of other conditions. So this is all bad news until now, what we discussed. But there is good news that is on the wisdom side. So we have been doing a study called SAGE, Successful Aging Evaluation Study. The question is, what is successful aging? The usual definition that people have used is successful aging is physically successful aging. There was Rowe and Kahn's definition that no physical disability. The problem with that definition is if you use that definition, most people are aging unsuccessfully because all of us with aging will develop arthritis, diabetes, hypertension. So what we wanted to do was look at not just physical aging, but also cognitive and mental aging, psychosocial aging, which is different from physical aging, right? So in terms of physical aging, what we find is that with age, we start developing illnesses and disabilities. Not surprising, right? Look at what happens to mental well-being. It goes exactly in the opposite direction. 20s, that's a fountain of youth, right? That's actually also a fountain of depression, anxiety, and stress. And think about your 20s. People are struggling to make decisions about are they going to continue education, are they going to start a job, having a partner, where to settle. And you always think you are doing worse than your peers. That's a very stressful period. But as you get older, you learn to cope with stresses, you accept some of them, and you try to overcome them. So well-being actually increases with aging. And that is successful aging, not just physically successful, but also mentally and psychosocially. Okay, this doesn't happen to everybody, but many people, it does. So our finding was in San Diegans. This was confirmed very recently in a nationwide study. This is a study published in Journal of Abnormal Psychology. It included more than 60,000 people from different states. And this is look at distress and anxiety and worry from age 18 to age 70. And this exactly replicates our findings that the period of 18, 19, 20, 20s, 30s, that's a period of greatest anxiety, distress, and worry. But as you get older, those things improve. And so when we found that, we started wondering if that is what is called wisdom of aging. And that led to the question, what is wisdom? So how do you know what is wisdom? Wisdom is an ancient historical and religious concept. But scientific research in wisdom started in 1970s. And since then it has been growing. A number of gerontologists, as well as psychologists, sociologists have been involved in this work. Wisdom is a personality trait like loneliness and resilience, but it's a complex trait. It includes several different components. So what we did was we looked at the literature and found out the common elements of wisdom in different definitions. So these include self-reflection, ability to look inside and understand yourself, compassion, empathy and compassion, helping others as well as helping self, emotional regulation, right? Control over the emotions, spirituality. This is different from religiosity. It is just accepting the fact that there is something beyond humanity, something that should make us feel humble. And accepting uncertainties in life. That I may have strong beliefs and values, but other people can have other beliefs and values, and there is no reason to believe that somebody is evil or wrong. So, wisdom is a composite trait that includes these different elements. So, at UCSD, we developed a scale to measure wisdom. There have been about a dozen such scales that are there. So this is the scale, San Diego Wisdom Scale, or SDY. It's a 24-item scale that takes only about 5 minutes to complete. And it includes items such as it is important that I understand the reasons for my action. So that is self-reflection. Or on the negative side, I had trouble thinking clearly when I'm upset. That shows lack of emotional regulation. Wisdom is also biologically based. So we published a paper on where the neurocircuitry of wisdom may lie, and it looks like it involves areas such as prefrontal cortex and limbic striatum. Some of these areas are also involved in loneliness, but at the opposite extreme. There is something called grandmother hypothesis of wisdom. And for us interested in aging, this is really very interesting. A number of studies have shown that when grandma helps her adult daughter D in raising her children, D, this adult daughter, lives longer, is happier, and produces more children than the grandma did. This has been shown in bottlenose dolphins, killer whales, a species of birds called Seychelles warblers and in humans. These are papers published in the highest scientific journals like Science and Nature. So it's not some feel-good TV science. It's actually based on hardcore science, which suggests that intergenerational activities may have evolutionary value. That if we can have grandparents transfer their wisdom to the grandchildren, and they don't have to be biological grandchildren, younger generation, that will be helpful for both the generations, actually all three generations. They will live longer, be happier, and the youngers will be. So with age, people are still very helpful for the younger generation. Why am I talking about loneliness and wisdom here? Because in the study that I just mentioned, that where we found age and loneliness, the biggest correlate of loneliness in the opposite direction was wisdom. The correlation between wisdom and loneliness was negative 0.53. As you know, in behavioral research, a correlation of 0.5 or higher is pretty strong. Of course, that was one study. Recently, we completed a study of more than 3,000 people using Mechanical Turk or MTurk on Amazon, and we found exactly the same thing. Correlation between wisdom and loneliness of negative 0.5 or greater. We have replicated that finding in another sample from Cilento in Italy, including people over the age of 90. So this is one of the most consistent findings we have had, the inverse relationship between loneliness and wisdom. And this may have some relevance to intervention, because this may mean that if we can improve wisdom, that is the traits associated with wisdom, the loneliness may go down. So how do you reduce loneliness? So people have talked about different kinds of interventions. Addressing maladaptive social cognition. There is sometimes in lonely people fear of contacting other people, right? Improving social skills, increasing opportunities for social interactions, and enhancing social support. But when it comes to wisdom, there are some specific areas. So actually, can we improve wisdom? We don't know that yet, but there are studies that show that components of wisdom can be increased. We have a review that will be coming out in a journal in the next couple of months. So we looked at all the randomized control trials that looked at psychosocial or behavioral intervention to increase emotional regulation, empathy or compassion, and spirituality. And we found that about 42% of these studies found a significant increase in those components with a moderate to large effect size. Again, in behavioral research, you don't see that moderate to large effect size with many interventions. And this was true in community, people with physical illnesses, as well as people with mental illnesses. So in other words, we can improve at least components of wisdom. Intergenerational activities. I already talked about this grandmother hypothesis. There's a very nice study called Experience Score. What they did in this study was they took some trained older volunteers who had retired, and they had to agree to spend at least 15 hours a week in a downtown elementary school. You know, these are kids coming from families with no grandparents, sometimes no parents. They found, and these older people, they were supposed to help the younger ones with their reading, writing, arithmetic, but also how to cope with life. They found at the end of the year, the kids did great. Their grades went through the roof. But importantly, the older people, they found that they became happier, their physical health improved, but this is the most remarkable thing. Their biomarkers of stress in blood and urine improved, and most fascinating, the volume of the hippocampus on MRI was larger in these people who completed this compared to control group who didn't. Just imagine this, that intergenerational activities helping just in one short year period. So, as I'm winding down my talk, so if you put it in broad context, as I said, you don't have those epidemics of plague, cholera, typhoid, etc. now because we have eradicated them through antibiotics and vaccines. We have new epidemics, behavioral epidemics, like with suicide, opioid abuse, loneliness. So we need behavioral vaccines for those. And wisdom might be one of those behavioral vaccines, as we can see from the relationship between the two in multiple studies. So why are we experiencing that? Technology and globalization during the last 3 decades have produced greater social changes and greater personal stress level than the previous 3 centuries. I mean, just imagine how things have changed radically. Imagine the time when we didn't have email. Imagine the time when we didn't have smartphones. And again, kids are the ones who are using these most. And so there is really social anomaly of the kind. Our brain is not used to handling such rapid stresses. And I think we are responding to that with this increased stress levels. This is a study that just came out. This is the Gallup poll on stress and worry. And in the US, they found that the level of stress and worry has increased 25% in just last 12 years. And this is something happening all over the world where there is considerable stress and anxiety now that was not there 30 years ago. So we need to do something about that. We need to do something at the individual level through interventions like the ones I described, but we need to do something at the societal level. I think what is happening that with the increased stress level in the younger people, we need the parents and grandparents to be the role models and controllers of this anxiety. The family discussions at the dinner table would be helpful, something that rarely occurs these days. Work with school teachers and intergenerational activities, as I said, are critical for both the generations. In the workplace, the number of suicides is increasing in medical students and physicians. Same thing is true for engineering students, law students, and a bunch of other professional schools. What happens is we teach them hard skills or professional skills. For example, physicians, we teach them how to be better physicians, how to diagnose illnesses, treat them better. We don't teach them how to take care of themselves or their patient mental life. Lack of compassion, either toward the patient or towards self. So what is needed is teaching soft skills, and especially in fields like gerontology, psychology, sociology, we rely on soft skill, establishing a relationship with the person we are talking to. We don't teach people how to do that, as well as how to take care of ourselves and reduce the stress. So, there are pills for wellness and longevity for this healthy lifestyle, of course, social support, and wisdom. Number of studies have shown that, for example, social support has larger effect size in terms of longevity than statins, than even doing exercise and stopping smoking. And these things don't cost anything except for human involvement. And so that really is the solution. And so if we do that, then we will have a world not of what they call silver tsunami. It's a disaster that older people are increasing. I call it a golden wave of healthy, happy, and wise older people. Let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Very much, Professor Jespe, for an amazing presentation. Outside, when you go out to the break, there are wisdom pills that you are invited to take. As you have seen, Professor Jespe is one of the leading scholars in the field and really breaks into new fields of knowledge in the gerontology. Our second speaker is also a very well-known gerontologist, Professor Emeritus Terry Seidman. He's from Melbourne, Australia, has written extensively in various fields in gerontology. And what impressed me, or what I learned about him in the last few days, that like many of us, he didn't begin as a gerontologist. He began from recreation, physical activity, and then entered the field of gerontology through that, and then flourished and published significantly. So it's an honor for me to present Professor Seidman. Please, the floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, faculty members, fellow colleagues, students, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today, to be sharing with colleagues the awesome task of trying to work out the challenges and the real aims and issues of moving gerontology further into the 21st century. Many years ago, when I was a student at the University of Oregon in the United States, I happened to stand in front of a podium or a lectern like I am now, and right at the bottom of the lectern was an imprint was, brevity is the inspired part of eloquence. I will attempt to be brief as I can today. My success at eloquence, I'll leave to you. Today, I want to have a kaleidoscope of aging in the 21st century. The German philosopher Goethe, age takes hold of us by surprise. It certainly has taken hold of me by surprise. I think it's taken hold of society by surprise. And it's all okay to have surprises, but we also need to be innovative and decision-making in terms of what that surprise entails for us. If I can just, it's not moving forward. Okay. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So I'm going to look at the kaleidoscope through, if you like, looking at the patterns and prisms. So we're going to use the metaphor. I'm a great believer in using metaphors that can give you some sort of an idea of having a bit more imagination in terms of what we can expect. Okay, the goal is to achieve new insights and understandings about human aging. So, what are some important questions that we need to be asking? What is the significance of aging and increased longevity for both society and individuals? What is the significance of it all? What is the significance and implications of population aging for lifelong learning? Lifelong learning. Some people can spend more time in retirement than they did at work. It's an incredible challenge. What are the policy, planning and program implications for population aging in urban and rural areas? Unfortunately, there's an imbalance when we're looking at aging, and many times we focus on the urban situation to the neglect of the rural. And there's some real challenges that have to be attacked in that direction. How might communities set about redesigning their spaces or better accommodate the needs of older people? Incidentally, when you accommodate the needs of older people, you make the environment also accommodating in a much more natural way for people all round. How might digital technology facilitate improved access to health and aged services in the 21st century? Health literacy is a real problem for all groups, including older people. Maybe digital technology might be of some assistance in that direction. How might courses in gerontology, both undergraduate and postgraduate, be marketed more successfully? Do not underestimate the territoriality of disciplines like medicine, social work, nursing, and rightly so. They've had to work hard to establish themselves. but we have a real challenge ahead of us to market and also be responsible for getting people into employment rather than just completing a degree, whether it's a postgraduate or undergraduate. Population ageing. It's a biological, social and cultural challenge. The biological challenge relates to the retention, if we can, of high physical and mental functioning. A huge challenge. The social challenge, to optimise intergenerational and community connectedness. If I could leave you with anything, I would say connect, connect and connect, because that's what it's about, with family and the wider community and people outside of family. The cultural challenge, to provide older individuals with the opportunity to live with purpose and dignity. Purpose and dignity. Our understanding of the biological and lifestyle factors that modulate life trajectories must also increase and be leveraged towards increasing human health span in step with human lifespan. We need to increase human health span. It's one thing to have an increased lifespan, but if we don't include ways and means and interventions to improve our health span, then our societies are going to be in for a huge problem. And when I look around my own world in Australia, I do see some older people really trying to work on that health dimension. For some people, the message is getting through, but not everybody. There's a changing numbers between the very young and older people. It's a global trend. Less younger people, less babies being born, and more older people living longer. But are they going to be able to live better? Ageing is a worldwide problem, both in developed and developing countries. It's not just in a few countries, but it is now a global trend, and we need to have ideas of sharing across nations about what innovations and what challenges people are dealing with in their own context. Food for thought. The kind of life older people can live in our society is a kind of life that we will live. It's not us and them. Unfortunately, we and sometimes even with gerontologists, there's a notion about us. We're going to study them. You're studying yourself. And for me, gerontology has been a privilege because it's given me insights to my own ageing self and presenting myself with some real challenges, not me saying that the challenges relate to other people. Population ageing is now a worldwide phenomenon warranting an urgent need for policymakers to imagine and create the world of tomorrow. By the way, if policymakers do not make a better world tomorrow, the world will deny them when they become older. And it might well be that there's a saying, what if I had done this, or what if I had done that? Individuals and their respective societies will need to think wholly about new ways about youth and about older age. On the spectrum, thinking more about youth and also more about older age. The future awaits our invention, facing three realities concerning population ageing. Reality number one. First, we have to acknowledge that future people of all ages, but especially older citizens, will be very different people with different capacities and capabilities and different outlooks and expectations and attitudes from their predecessors. My children are going to have very different ideas about ageing for themselves. And so we have to make sure that we are aware that as people are moving into middle age and beyond, they're going to be very different from our parents. They're going to be very different from my generation in the way they think and their expectations they'll have. Look at what's happening in France when the president is trying to tamper, if you like, with pensions. In Australia, the Labor government recently were down absolute certainty to win the election 6 months ago. There was no way known that the Liberal government were going to win. they made one fatal mistake. They tried to tamper with the pension entitlements that people were supposed to have through franking credits related to having assets relating to shares. People, older people who were staunch Labor Party members, voted against their own party. And so policymakers and governments need to be aware about the expectations that older people have, particularly when they feel that they've earned the rights that they have at the present time. Reality number 2. We have the power to shape the future we would like for our ageing society. We have the power. The power is already there to make decisions. Unfortunately, sometimes power is abused, it's misplaced, misdirected. Reality number 3. Megatrends, those significant environmental, economic and social conditions that are playing out throughout the world, cannot be ignored in the field of gerontology. Gerontology cannot ignore megatrends. They have to work within the context of those trends. For example, technology has to relate to gerontology. We have to think very clearly about it. There are also the demographics of what's happening around the world. There is the notion of health. There is the notion of sustainability and the notion of mobility. There are large groups of people moving around the world now, and many societies have been placed with enormous pressures on dealing with people of all ages, including older people who come from very different worlds, of which we have to learn about them and create, if you like, a cultural sensitivity to working with them. They're very different in many ways, the way they think and the sorts of expectations that they will have. We need to be making sure we have staff and graduates who can understand those cultural sensitivities, and they're working with older people. At the same time, there's other ways of looking at megatrends. But right now, climate change is making a huge impact. Huge impact. And what does climate change mean in terms of older people? What does it mean in terms of the sorts of approaches you should be taking? I mean, there are people in Australia, when the high temperatures come, cannot afford to turn on an air conditioner. They don't have the money. What's going wrong there? In the wintertime, they can freeze because they can't put on the heater, because pensions and their ability to sustain themselves is very, very difficult to do. And so climate change is one. And there are other changes about the way in which natural resources are diminishing at a huge rate. Natural resources. Okay, so we just can't ignore these trends that are happening. They need to be built into our thinking, our policy making, and our planning for the future. A look at reality. Together, reality and probability imply increasing numbers of older people, and relative to the entire population, fewer and fewer children. Fertility rates are dropping quite dramatically. Longevity in the added years is predicted by the year 2050 that life expectancy in countries will approximate 100 years. At the moment in Australia, there's something like about 5,000 people who have approached 100 years of age or over. By the year 2050, they expect it'll be 30,000 Australians will be 100 years of age or over. Some will be living in their own homes, others will require residential aged care. What are we doing about preparing people to be in that particular workforce? The 100-year life, living and working in an age of longevity. The gift of longevity is an opportunity, it's an invitation to completely rethink how we structure our lives. There will be people in this room today that will reach 100. Some will be in good health and some will not. What sorts of society have we got that can help to work with those people in order to make life meaningful? The linear three-stage life involving education, career and retirement, as we used in the 20th century, is now gone. It'll involve 4 or more stages. There are people now at 50, 55, 60 thinking about new careers, not about retirement, not wanting to go on pensions. Longevity will change how, when, and where we learn, find work, choose partners and start families, which presents challenges for individuals, employers and governments. Longevity is here, and it's changing the whole way in which we frame. When I left school, it was a matter of getting an education, getting a job, reaching 60, 65, retiring, and making way for the younger people. That's changing right now. It's absurd to think that many times we throw the baby out with the bathwater when in fact a person reaches 65 or 67 and they're expected to retire. When in fact their energies, their motivations, their incentives are still very high. There's an old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, I'm not aware of any research on old dogs, but I can tell you right now, there are plenty of people who can do incredible things through retraining. Quite capable of being involved in retraining, rather than have an attitude about, well, you're old, therefore you are now obsolete. We have to challenge that attitude all the way. 5 principal scenarios. There's a growing challenge in the field of bioethics to accept that ageing is not only complex, but allows for creative individual variation. The older you get, the more unique you become. Questions are now emerging that concern the nature, possibilities and purpose of human existence in later life. What does it mean to be a person now in your 90 years of age? 4 weeks ago, I stood on a stage with a man who is 109 years old. He still rides a bike. He's cognitively extremely alert and still works in the field, occasionally in a hazelnut field up in the highlands in Turkey. Unbelievable. And when we got talking, I'm 80 years of age, and I said to the media people, this man is 29 years older than I am. And the way he walked up steps and stairs was remarkable. But he said to me one of the major things that enabled him to get to where he did with good health is that he wasn't involved in a stressful life. And that came through with our recent comment by our colleague here. Changing paradigms of ageing are fostering now a rethink among health professionals as to the types of social policy interventions that will be needed in order to foster the potentials of people in older age. We are wasting huge resources in just casting people off into the retirement world. Ageing and long-term care will have implications for workforce recruitment and skills requirements. Advances in medicine and patient care will mean that continuous training and skill development will be necessary in the aged care industry. It's not good enough now to graduate, whether it's in medicine, social work, gerontology, whatever. We need to update our skills through workshops, continuing education type programs. I have a daughter who was recently in charge of a nursing facility, a retirement aged care facility, and we've just finished writing a paper called Leaving But Not Yet Left. A challenge to the notion of God's waiting room rather than involving them in humanistic care. When you think about it, oh well, they're here, they're just waiting, it's God's waiting room, so we don't need to pay very much attention, just treat them with the basics. Well, we need to change that mentality amongst the staff and also the policymakers. The practice of using age 65 now as retirement is outdated, outmoded. And there is an argument, well, if we retire people at 65, we make room for work for young people. That's nonsense. What employees often do is they lose people, but they don't always necessarily take on new employees. So we need to give some thought to that old outdated notion. Inequality. Due recognition must be given to gender differences, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, level of education, health status, disability and poverty. By the way, there is a poverty of opportunity for some people, and we need to tackle that very quickly. So there are factors in how life will be lived now and in the future. We need to look at these particular aspects of inequality. The good life, live well, stay well. The gerontological challenge is connecting research, policy and practice. Far too often we have researchers doing some wonderful work, but it doesn't impact the policymakers, or it's not in a language that can be understood by the policymakers. And of course then we have practice that then needs to be evaluated. Oh, well, we've got it going now, we've done that job. No, once you start to have your research findings and policy resulting in practice, you then need to evaluate the sorts of things that help for aspects of well-being. Active, healthy ageing. What are the dimensions and issues? Well, we have a whole range of things. There's the labour contracts, the employability aspects that are available. We need to have a look at health, both for ageing well and for those people who've been made vulnerable by a period of time. And of course, welfare payments. Will there be sufficient funds for people to be given pensions? Are we planning ahead? Incidentally, with longevity, many people are finding that their retirement funds are running short. I only planned to live to 75, and now I'm 85. Well, we need to be giving much more thought to how that we might rectify that particular issue. Geographical gerontology. I discovered gerontology by doing an honours degree in geography. We should be working in close concert with geographers, much more than we've done in the past, about the spaces, the places and the landscapes in which older people are living or will live. So geographers, in concert with gerontologists, can do some wonderful work at both the macro and the micro level. And we need to be encouraging that union much more than we've done in the past. Beyond the biomedical model, gerontology is an important field of study that will continue to offer special opportunities for critically examining the status quo. I commend the critical gerontologists that are now emerging in the field. They are examining very closely some of the inequities, some of the shortfalls of policies and programs. And they're very much into having a look at social structures and how they impact in a negative way or a positive way with the older populations. Movements are now underway to reframe the concept of care. What sort of care would you want if you were in a residential aged care facility? I am amazed how policymakers who can make a difference in terms of aged care seem to find ways of avoiding it. They may one day wake up in a residential aged care and wish they'd done something to change it when they had the opportunity to do it. Recognition about action research. We need more action research. And keep in mind that one of the three, or if you like, the three plagues in nursing homes are boredom, helplessness, and loneliness in nursing homes. God's waiting room mentality creates those sorts of things, and we need to challenge it. Care cannot be understood without recognising that it's genetically a relationship with some degree of bidirectionality. There's the caregiver, and there's also the care recipient. And it's a two-way process, not just one way. Care is thus a mutually generative, interactive, and hence a two-way process. And all carers, whether informal or formal, need to appreciate that. It's not just doing something to them, the care recipient, but it's respecting and working with them in both a respectful and a listening way. End-of-life care. We need more thought about end-of-life care. Palliative care, when palliative care can be issued, how it can be issued, what sort of support we give to carers, both formal and informal. Far too many people are struggling to care for a loved one in the home situation. And we need to be looking at innovative ways of helping them to have time out and whatever. There's a colleague of mine in Turkey that has set up something like about 50 old buildings in various municipalities through Turkey, and they become day respite care centres for families where they can leave their loved ones for a day while they can gain, if you like, a little bit of balance in terms of where they are. He's convinced municipalities in Turkey, you've got old building over there, why not convert it and get some funds? And it's created a real sense of community in many Turkish areas and villages that previously had nowhere to go to get respite care. Ageing in rural communities. What is the nature of ageing experience in rural communities? Need understandings of surrounding access and availability of services. We need more rural research on ageing. Out-migration of young people. Young people are moving out of rural settings very quickly into the big urban environments, and there's the potential for increased loneliness too. There is a view that rural communities are very connected. Yes, they are. Historically, they've shown that, but we shouldn't assume that that's going to always be the case. Distance, isolation, housing, income and access to services are critical in terms of looking at the rural environments. And keep in mind, the rural environments are what gives us our food. We need to protect them. We need to look at it and to honour those people that have now probably moved off the farm but are still living within those rural communities. What about community gerontology? It opens up opportunities to work in the local communities. Universities need to actively utilise their intellectual assets to do public good. Universities are accountable for doing public good in whatever fields we want to look at. Gerontology is one of them. The utilisation of older people as experts in contributing to high quality research is not being used wisely. Recently, we did a large survey of older people in one of the municipalities in Melbourne, and because we had access to a university of the third age that I'd set up several years before, we actually used volunteers where we gave them training programs and they helped to do some interviewing for us. The third age people became interviewers in a large-scale research project. Smart people just needed to be given some insights as to how to be a good interviewer. And it saved us enormous amounts of money and at the same time gave them a very meaningful opportunity to be involved in a large-scale research project. 8 domains of research for fostering age-friendly cities. Think about it. Housing, social participation, respect for social inclusion, civic participation, and so forth. And we've got all these areas that need to be looked at if we're going to create age-friendly cities. By the way, if we make them age-friendly, we're making them friendly for most people, if not all. The bottom line is that the challenges raised by ageing populations are formidable, but not insurmountable. Collectively, we can affect the outcome. Collectively. Not alone. The key will be the adaptation of all levels of both individual, organisational and societal. Together we can make change. Alone, it makes it very difficult to do so. A science of ageing that starts in the physiology of change rather than its significance to the individual is not speaking for the ageing person. A science of ageing that focuses entirely on the physiological aspects of it is not speaking to the ageing person themselves. The psychology of ageing is incredibly important. The psychology of ageing is absolutely important. Like it or not, there must be serious efforts to rethink age in an ageing world. Those destined to live a significant part of their lives in the 21st century must become habituated to thinking in wholly new ways about youth and age, inventing novel institutions to provide for both. The future of ageing. The future is not preordained. Population ageing holds within it the promise of a much better society for all of us, or, paradoxically, a far worse one. The choice is clearly there, and it's ours to make, all of us. First and foremost, there must be a genuine political commitment to initiate the courage to explore the limits of the possible. And then, building upon this exploratory exercise, the future of ageing will depend substantially upon political consensus, the mobilisation of political intentions, and the will and the political ingenuity to shape the future of ageing. It's an enormous task, but it's possible. It's not impossible, it's possible. And we've got to start to understand that human dignities and respect for all ages, including older people, is an absolute measure of the worth of any human society. No statement or philosophical viewpoint on ageing can speak to all of us, for ageing is a unique and personal process. It takes courage to live fully and vitally in old age. Accept the unfolding process of life and strive to build an attitude that incorporates a strong and enduring sense of hopefulness, openness and enthusiasm. It has often been noted that the aged comprise the one minority group that nearly all of us will enter. Think about it. It's the one minority group that all of us have the great potential to enter. Don't ignore that trend. Most people will live long enough to get old. The message for policymakers and health professionals is to be very careful, be extraordinarily careful. As we think about the future of ageing, think carefully about the future you imagine and propose to construct, because the future you construct may be your own. Think about it. Ignore it, and you may inherit a future that you wish you had had the opportunity when you did to change it. Perhaps for no other reason than enlightened self-interest, we should all move our thoughts and actions to building a society that is prepared to support the building and staffing of residential aged care environments that operate on high-quality assurance systems that support and sustain the well-being, respect and dignity of all aged care residents. You may one day be an occupant. And note, gerontologists are also part of the ageing process. I'm amazed that some people have all the knowledge in the world about health and well-being, and they even preach it and teach it. They don't apply it to themselves. Thank you very much. May I leave you with one thought that might be of some use. Ageing is mostly a matter of mind. If you really don't mind, it really doesn't matter.
Thank you very much, Professor Seidman. סיימנו את הסשן הראשון. לפני שאנחנו יוצאים להפסקה, אני רוצה להודות למתורגמת שלנו, עורכת דין צבי אדמון. תודה רבה על העבודה שלך.